Hi, I'm Pat Kaiser. I'm director of the Center for Native Grasslands at University of Tennessee, and I want to talk to you a little bit today about the working lands model for wildlife conservation for grasslands wildlife, and specifically the strategy or some thoughts at least about getting producers to adopt native grass forages. So I want to start off reminding folks that maybe aren't familiar with the humid eastern United States what the Fescue-belt is. And this talk is not specific necessarily to the Fescue-belt, but that's certainly a good framework in which to think about all of these constructs, because the logic and rationality of including a warm season perennial grass in a forage system that is dominated by a cool season perennial grass makes a lot of sense. The logic is there. And the point I just wanted to make here is that the Fescue-belt and the eastern grassland systems, for those that are from the Great Plains or other parts of the country, is a big forage system. Lots of acres, lots of producers, lots of calves, and lots of dollars. So it's a big deal. The other thing I want to stress is that within this part of the country, we have very little CRP and lots of total forage. And that CRP, much of it is not necessarily in grass. And so there's a huge disparity there, which is a real argument for why we need to be thinking about a working lands model and not just doing window dressing in small patches around the edge of this large system. Another thing I want to drive home again to a lot of the biologists out there is I feel like we have considered the cow our mortal enemy in terms of grassland conservation or wildlife conservation, and no doubt in places that's been a safe assumption. But I want to remind y'all that Leopold saw the cow as being part of the portfolio of tools that could be used to restore grasslands, healthy grasslands, and associated wildlife. And I want to remind folks as well that throughout eastern North America, we had these great big herbivores that you see there in that picture that were very much a part of the inherent disturbance package of these eastern grasslands. A contemporary study being done in central Kentucky, the red hashed area are native grass pastures being grazed not with bison but with commercial cattle, and the blue dots are where quail are using. What you can see on the east side of the picture, the right side of the picture, is conventional tall fescue pastures, and you see no use by quail. And in the native pastures, you see lots of use by quail. And just as an aside, the blue dots that represent quail locations to the west, the southwest portion of this image, are areas where native grass establishment is underway. And so it's kind of a weedy mess in midstream. So again, reinforces the value of native grasses and native grasses being grazed. And so I'm not going to spend a lot more time explaining or describing or justifying the working lands model, but I wanted to start off with that common understanding that the way I look at this is that this working land model is not only an option for wildlife conservation of grassland species, but it is probably the model, the overwhelmingly preferred model that's going to have the greatest impact in the long run, again, because of scale and because of how closely it mimics natural disturbance patterns in grasslands of eastern North America. And to that end, we've put together a very recent paper in the Wildlife Society Bulletin that I'd encourage you all to look at that addresses this in much, much more detail. And by the way, this is a model that has been discussed for quite a few years, and I think the time has come to really put ourselves behind it and try to implement this at a large scale. So if we are looking at a working lands model, then the people that we're trying to reach and communicate with are not other biologists per se. What we're trying to communicate with is the beef cattle producers that manage those 37 million acres of tall fescue and the 60-some million acres of total forages in the eastern United States. Those are the people that we need to be talking to. And so with that in mind, I want to move into and unpack a little bit of information that we've developed on the human dimension side about who these folks are and what motivates them. So this is a survey that was conducted back in 2011. And I want to point out that this was conducted early in the spring, April, when things are nice and wet and green, following a year, 2010, with an average to above average precipitation. And what we see here is even under those unstressed conditions, 53% of our producers were either interested or very interested in improving summer forage production. And again, recall, we're in a part of the world where we rely overwhelmingly on cool season perennials. So the fact that they are interested in improving summer forage production really shouldn't surprise us. The number of them that are interested in that and think it's a priority is what's impressive. More recent survey from a subset of producers that attended some forage workshops this past winter, in fact, one of the things that came out of that when we asked them the question about how important was extending the grazing season, it was almost unanimous support that this is an important part of their strategy to remain viable beef production operations, to remain profitable, stay in business. And so we see that improved summer forage production is very important to our producers, but also extending the grazing season. And so by putting a warm season perennial into a cool season dominated system, we provide more grazing days in the summer, but we also extend the grazing season for those cool season perennials deeper into the fall and the winter through stockpiling. So again, an excellent strategy and one that producers are already interested in and really doesn't necessarily take a lot of selling. This is a third survey that was conducted through some folks here at the University of Tennessee and that I participated in more recently, 2018, if memory serves. And this was asking about producers' willingness to adopt warm season grasses. Now, this is not specific to native grasses, but warm season grasses in general. And what I want to draw your attention to there, where that red circle is on the left side of the slide, is by a 6-to-1 ratio, producers anticipate positive outcomes from adopting warm season forages. So the blue bar means that they think they have increased pasture productivity, increased forage quality, increased livestock health and nutrition. The orange bars are sort of neutral. They don't really think it's going to have a big impact. And the gray bars are those that think it would not be beneficial. Once again, we see a very clear pattern here that there's this overwhelming expectation among these producers that using a warm season forage is going to provide a lot of benefit to their operation. And so again, that helps us in terms of approaching this audience. The other thing I want to point out is over here with the second red circle is the concerns about management burden. Basically, is adopting a warm season forage going to be too big of a headache? Well, there is about a one-to-one relationship here between those who either think that it will increase their burden or not really improve. Well, let me restate that. It'll decrease the burden or not impact them negatively. Those numbers are about equal to those who think it'll be worse. So if you're going to get a great big gain and it's either not going to affect you or not increase your management burden, in other words, it's a wash, why not pick up all this gain that you're going to get in terms of forage quality and productivity? And so while I'd love to see this be a 10-to-1 in favor, the fact that it's kind of a 50-50 split tells me that producers recognize there's more work involved, but there's a lot of benefit involved. Another question we asked in the same recent 2018 survey is how often producers completely renovated a pasture. Now, this is an important question because to convert from cool season, tall fescue or other species to native grasses requires a complete renovation of the site. And if this is a practice or exercise or experience that's not familiar at all to producers, then maybe it's unlikely that they will be willing to do this. And what we see here is there's about 20% of our producers for which this is a familiar approach to renovating pastures. And we see another 20% there that have dabbled in it. There's 60% that this is an alien concept to. So what we see is that most producers are interested in warm season grasses, improved summer forage production, and increased grazing season length, but there's only about 20 to 40% of them that have actually gone to the trouble to renovate pastures in a way that would be similar to adopting native grasses. So what that kind of tells us is that we're really only talking to maybe 20 to 40% of the producer base, at least initially, on such an idea. Another thing that's kind of interesting that came out of the 2018 survey is the adoption rate as a function of cost share for adopting warm season grasses. Again, not just natives, but all warm season grasses. And this line basically, you see a little wiggle there at $35 an acre and maybe a little dip up at 175. But in talking to the economists that ran this, their interpretation of that line is that statistically speaking, that's a flat line. Put another way is that about half of our producers would respond to cost share. Another half, cost share is not a motivating factor. And that has shown up in our earlier 2011 survey as well. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't want to abandon or walk away from cost share programs, but we also have to recognize their limitations. It's not going to get everybody's attention, and it's not the sole solution to the problem. I think, as we'll see here in a minute, the real solution, whether it's those interested in cost share or not, is going to be education. And so that's really where we have to focus. And that's where this comes in. Back in our 2011 survey, we asked producers what their level of familiarity was with native warm season grasses. And we defined those grasses. We told them which species we were talking about. And what really should jump out at you, the overwhelming result here, is that we're looking at 67%, 2/3, reported that they were not at all familiar with native grasses. And you see another, 28% there that consider themselves somewhat familiar. But the real take-home message here is folks just do not know about native warm season grasses as a forage option. And so that clearly creates a mandate that we need to do a much better job of educating them. And again, evidence-based objective education, not selling, as sometimes I catch myself saying or hear others say. The other thing that we did is we asked producers and, extension professionals and NRCS and Soil and Water Conservation District field staff, they're the same question. And what we find, and on the one hand, is that the level of knowledge is obviously much greater. Those bars are shifted to the right. But if you take those two lowest categories, not at all or only somewhat familiar, that's nearly half of our natural resources and agricultural educators out there. And so our education program doesn't have to be focused strictly on producers. In fact, it has to be focused on some of our peers who are out there communicating with these producers to increase their level of knowledge and familiarity with native warm season grasses. The other thing I wanted to emphasize here is that if we take that 25 to 30% who characterize themselves as being somewhat familiar and start asking them specific questions about native warm season grasses, we find that they don't really feel comfortable answering those questions. So recall that 67% said they were not at all familiar, but here we have nearly 80% who said they really don't know how much they yield. And that's a pretty basic question that we asked, and we asked a number of such questions. So most of them, even though there's 33% say that they're somewhat familiar or more, most of those don't really feel like they're in a position to say how much they yield. The other thing I want to point out here is that their assessment of that yield is biased low. So we see the most common answer here, the modal answer, is 2 to 3 tons per acre. Well, for most of these natives, there's ample data that shows that they really produce 3 to 5 tons per acre, and in some cases even better than 5 tons per acre. So what we see is that the expectation of what these native grasses can do is biased low. And in question after question that we asked about specific attributes of native grasses, we find that those who express that they have some knowledge about it tend to underestimate the benefits and unfortunately overestimate the liability. And so not only do we have a lack of knowledge, but we seem to have a bias that is less than favorable towards native grass forages. And I think that reflects the past educational efforts not only have not been adequate to reach a large enough part of the population, target population, but they've also been a little lacking in terms of the data that shows what native grasses can do. And again, we need to be objective in how we educate, but objectively, this over here is the right answer, not this over here. And so, again, there's a lot that needs to be corrected in our understanding of native grass forages. This, again, goes back to our producer groups that we met with this past winter. And I want to point out that the population that we asked these surveys of, there's 225 producers at 6 workshops. 3 of the workshops, the audiences had come not specifically to learn about native grasses, but they had come to learn about beef and or forages more generally. And that's represented by these blue bars. And so at the conclusion of the session, we asked them how likely they were to adopt native warm season grasses to plant a pasture or hayfield. And what you can see is there's a lot of these average beef producers, 50%, that are kind of not real committed to doing that. But again, we see here 30-some%, another 10% here. So 40-45% collectively that are willing to take this pretty seriously. Now, those that showed up to the native grass only meetings, or meetings that were focused on native grass, we see a much higher likelihood to adopt, really about 80%. So again, I mentioned earlier that there was about 20-40% of our producers that had done pasture innovation before. And again, here we see sort of 20-40%, that even 10-50% that show some interest in pursuing this idea of native grasses. And from a lot of our surveys and a lot of the questions we ask, what we really find is there's probably, again, 20-40% that are more progressive, more engaged, more innovative forage producers. And that, within the larger population of our 300-some thousand beef producers in the region, is our target audience. Those are the folks that are willing to try these things, that want the warm season grasses, that want the improved summer forage production, and are willing to go to the extent that is needed to implement such a innovation on their operation. But there is a pretty decided difference between these folks that are maybe hearing about native grasses for the first time, or the first time they've heard about them in detail, versus those who already have a propensity to want to learn more about native grasses. And we see that once they're educated about them, there is a real high likelihood that they would adopt native grasses. So again, pretty encouraging, and a focus on where in the population we should be looking. Now, another question we asked these producers from this winter's workshops, and we've asked this question in a previous survey back in 2011, what are the reasons that keep them from adopting native grasses? And we see a real consistent pattern here. And what it really comes down to is the hill they have to climb during the conversion process. So the fact that you get no production during the seedling year, the overall cost, which again, we've already talked about the prospective role of cost share in reducing that, but nevertheless, that's in mind, the time and effort that it takes to do it. This gets back to the educational issue, but again, a lot of this really focuses back on the conversion process itself. Interestingly enough, over here, there's very few producers that seem to think that there's some other reason, or there's a lack of benefit to adopting native grasses, or that they don't need a warm season perennial. It's really the issue of getting there from here. And that's both a challenge, but also an encouragement that is where we really need to, along with education, focus on this here. So what is that message then that we need to bring to these producers? I've already touched on it some, but let me just dig into it in a very explicit way. Traditionally, those of us in the conservation community have tended to talk about native grasses through our own experience. We talk about them in terms of grasshopper sparrows, northern bobwhites, soil health. To beef cattle producers, these are the things where we really need to be focused. Stand life, cost effectiveness, economics, soil health, that's becoming more of an issue, but things like drought resiliency. And again, at least in the fescue-belt, we need to focus not on trying to eradicate tall fescue, which I've heard many biologists talk about. We need to talk about complementing our tall fescue systems. Ultimately, what we need to be portraying, because it's accurate, is that native grasses are merely one more tool in a forage producer's toolbox, but they're tools that have value, that have benefit, that are cost effective, and we need to focus on that dimension of it, not some grand crusade against non-natives or a focus on wildlife, because that's not where these producers live. That's not our audience. Let me focus for a moment, and I could give lengthy examples of every one of these. I just want to use a single example, a single slide to talk about this cost effectiveness and how data is our friend. So this is a recent field research project we did at the University of Tennessee, where we compared 5 summer forage options, an annual that was planted every single year, an improved Bermuda grass, and 3 natives. And I guess I should change this from in press to the full citation, because this has been published, in fact, in 2020. But we looked at net returns per acre of these forages. And this was for the summer grazing season, so it has its limitations. It's not a system study. But the real take-home message here is that these native grasses easily outperform, in terms of net return per acre, an annually planted species, which gets very expensive, or a high input species like Bermuda grass. And so despite the high outfront cost of establishment and lack of production during the seedling year, which were built into these models, what we see is that natives can tell a really good story on economics. So to me, this is an example of what we need to emphasize to our producers, is some of the practical science, evidence-based facts about native grasses. We don't need to adorn this and fluff it up and spit shine it. It tells its own story. Back on the establishment issue too, I think we've done ourselves a huge disservice through the years of convincing people that native grasses are incredibly difficult, maybe almost impossible to establish. And in reality, our experience is that we have 85, 90, 95% success rate on the first crack. A second problem is that we tend to emphasize that second year production is not an option. It is a reasonable goal, and it's something that we have routinely done in our part of the country. And so we've got to move away from the idea that native grasses are nigh on impossible to establish, that you've got to know some black magic. And here's a picture to reinforce that message. That is a first year stand established in Arkansas, planted in April, picture taken in August. That is not an unusual outcome. We can get there from here, and we've just got to do a better job about talking about establishment. So let me give you all a little quiz to wrap up here. How hard are establishing and managing native grasses? Because some people seem to think it's difficult. Is it as hard as climbing Pikes Peak with a pack on your back? 7,400 foot net elevation gain to 14,000 plus feet? Or is it more like climbing 2,700 foot net elevation gain to about 5,000 foot elevation, where there's still little oxygen? Or is it more like climbing a 250 foot hill on a hot summer day? Or is it like floating down a river with a negative gradient? In other words, all you have to do is steer the boat. Well, I think we have sold native grass establishment and management maybe over here, possibly over here. My answer, it's some work, it's a challenge, it's not child's play. You got to pay attention to what you're doing, but it can be done. So how we get there, I use this analogy of baseball. Getting to first base is necessary but not sufficient for scoring a home run. And so if we can get in the batter's box by having a good story to tell, and we can educate our professionals, maybe that puts us on first. Getting the same message to producers maybe puts us in scoring position. Maybe we're on second. Getting to third base, we're really threatening to get that run, is going to really have to be helped by the adoption by what we refer to innovators and early adopters. They have to get into the game to really bring us home for a score. And ultimately, I've talked about maybe 40% of our producers a little more innovative, that are willing to try different things. And that's probably our home run, is when we get to that 35, 40% threshold. And again, as I said, while tagging each base is necessary, it is not sufficient to get that home run. And so we've kind of got to do all of that if we want to be successful. And again, an important and critical part of this is a sound educational program based on science. So to summarize, we've got to focus on working lands, and we've got to tailor that message to the folks who are going to implement working lands conservation. In other words, cattle producers. And I've already talked about being objective, evidence-based in our presentation. We don't want to be making wild claims or underselling native grasses, apologizing for them, or emphasizing the problems in an undue way. One other thing that we've talked about recently, some of us engaged in this, is that we really think there's probably a value in concentrating our effort in some key strategic target areas where community adoption can become more prevalent, neighbor to neighbor. And again, we have to focus on that 10 or even 5 to 15% of the producer community that is most likely to want to play around with novel ideas and innovations in their forage program. That's where we're going to have the most success. And ultimately, while those of us in the conservation world are the messengers now to a large extent, a really important strategic goal is to get the messengers to ultimately be within the agricultural community itself. And I've talked about neighbor to neighbor, I've talked about educating our extension agents and NRCS folks, but we really have got to get the agricultural community, the beef community, to become the purveyors of this message. So with that, I'll wrap up, and if there's time for questions, we'd be glad to try to handle those. Thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate you joining us for this presentation.